Die politische Kaste, das ist am Ende opportunes Verhalten.
The political class, in the end, is all about opportunistic behavior. Career paths are limited. I can't explain it any other way. I don't believe in some grand plan. I should say that clearly. Maybe such a plan exists, but I don't believe it. I think things just happen the way they happen. We'll only be able to afford morality when we can actually afford it. If we keep slowing down the economy, if we start talking about energy lockdowns or whatever else, well, we're not an IT hub. SAP is the only major DAX company that emerged after reunification from the tech or IT sector.
There's not much else to say. Do you personally get the impression that the business community in Germany is longing for failed policies to finally come to an end? Against the current, about the person.
Hello,
and welcome to Against the Current. We present viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media choose to ignore. Russia will always be our enemy, said the German foreign minister. Someone who knows better is Dr. Oliver Kempkens. He worked as a manager for SAP and Anderson Consulting. Until Russia's invasion in February 2022, he was with the Russian Sberbank. Today, he's a headhunter based in Munich. He studied sociology and has taught as a professor at Stanford in the United States and in Moscow. Welcome, Oliver Kempkens.
Thank you very much.
Your path to Russia went through the German War Graves Commission. How did that happen?
Like so often when you're young, the biggest influence on me was one of my teachers. I started out at a secondary school and later moved on to a high school. It was that time in life when kids start to spread their wings and go on trips with friends. Mallorca, Rimini, that kind of thing never really interested me. And then there was this teacher, my art teacher, who was deeply interested in history. He once said to me, "There's something that might sound a bit strange. It's called the German War Graves Commission, but they organize international educational trips." These trips went to places where there had been fighting during the Second World War and the First World War, places where many Germans had died, but also many people from other countries. He said his son, who I think was about a year younger than me at the time, was also interested. And he said, "Why don't you go somewhere with my son Johannes, whom I didn't know back then? Somewhere in the East. Just do it." So that's what I did. At first, we actually wanted to go to Volgograd, or to Ososhka. That's the soldiers' cemetery north of Volgograd, the former Stalingrad, right? My mother, who was a single parent and we were from Essen, looked at the map and said, "No, that's too far for me. I've never been to Russia, and I don't trust it. You're not going there." So we agreed on Latvia instead, and that's how we ended up going to Sigulda, Latvia, for the first time.
I once accompanied a group of students on an exchange trip to St. Petersburg. They were between 14 and 16 years old, curious about many things, but not about German-Russian history. During the trip, we visited a German military cemetery, and there was this young girl who hadn't seemed particularly interested in history. She stood in front of a memorial plaque with Russian and German inscriptions and suddenly said, "My grandpa is buried here." In that moment, you could really see how German-Russian history suddenly became part of her everyday life. How was it for you? I think probably quite similar.
Well, I mean, when you think about it, I've been to, I think, 5 military cemeteries in total. Once in Petersburg, I was in Sigulda, and I helped initiate the cemetery in Belarus, north of Bobruisk, on the Boba River. And then I went to Rososhka, near Volgograd, especially Rososhka, where I believe about 1.1 million people died in the Stalingrad region. There, even today, if you stick a spade into the ground, into that famous southern Russian steppe, you still find bones. And of course, we did that too. because the colleagues from the War Graves Commission, who were employed there and carried out the exhumations, demonstrated it to us. That's really quite depressing. We don't know anything like that ourselves. We grew up here in comfort, with stability and structure. But of course, we also know the situation here, at least in the Ruhr area where I'm from, where almost every week a World War II bomb is discovered in some other city. I've seen the maps showing where those bombs were dropped. As someone from Essen, I'm naturally a Rot-Weiss Essen fan, and I still remember that years ago, maybe 10 years back, they even found a bomb on RWE's training grounds. So in that sense, the war is still very much present. But then, when you're actually in Russia and experience the culture there, the Russian culture, compared to the German one, is much more focused on the past. That's something you can clearly observe in society. And it's something that's also recognized academically. It plays a very different role there. Of course, that's something to think about seriously. And when you realize how many Red Army soldiers died back then, yes, we rightly talk about the 6 million Jews who were killed in World War II. But there were also, depending on the estimate, around 15 to 17, maybe even 20 million Red Army soldiers or Soviets who lost their lives.
Insgesamt sind es 27 Millionen Sowjetbürger geschätzt, die in diesem Krieg, im Zweiten Weltkrieg, dem großen Vaterländischen, aus der russischen Perspektive ums Leben gekommen sind. Wie haben Sie gemerkt, dass dieser Vernichtungskrieg kein Krieg war wie jeder andere?
Ja, an der schieren Zahl.
By the sheer number. By the sheer number. And I really noticed it in the difference. German soldiers usually died wearing their dog tags. And when a German soldier is exhumed today, you typically still find a heavily rusted tag. Russian or Soviet soldiers, on the other hand, often didn't have that. They had this little, well, what do you call it? A small container with a slip of paper inside. Sometimes it was there, sometimes it wasn't. And today, nothing of that remains. It's all weathered away.
But
even in the past, there probably wasn't always someone inside because people had to be sent to the battlefield quickly. And when you know that, and when you're in Russia and actually talk to Russians, and not just Russians, but also Tajiks, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Latvians, Estonians, Turkmen, almost everyone has a story. With 27 million Soviet citizens who died, of course they do. And you really feel that much more strongly there than you do here, because here it's often not just about losses, but also about people who were wounded or traumatized. In Russia, it's usually simply the dead.
The lost or the dead. How do you explain that the industrialized mass murder of the Jewish population is seen today as such a central part of German guilt and responsibility, while the mass murder of Russian civilians and captured Red Army soldiers isn't? Well, I think that's the key question. It's a complex one.
Ja, ich glaube, das ist die Gretchenfrage. Das ist eine komplexe Frage. Ich glaube, wenn man sich anschaut.
I think, when you look at it, of course there were also concentration and prison camps where Bolsheviks and communists were taken. But in people's perception, and probably also in sheer numbers, there were mostly civilians, ordinary citizens. And we often make this distinction between Jews and Bolsheviks, or Soviet citizens, even though many Jewish fellow citizens who came from Belarus, which at the time was a socialist republic of the Soviet Union, were, of course, also Soviet citizens. We tend to leave that part out and say it was only Jews who were sent there, but in fact, they were also Soviet citizens.
Die dorthin gekommen sind, aber es waren natürlich auch Sowjetbürger. Also ich glaube, das ist eine gewisse Unschärfe und eine Verkürzung, die
I think there's a certain blurriness there, a kind of oversimplification that's happening. And then historically speaking, it's also just the case that, well, Russia has always been somewhat hard for Germans to grasp. Even back in World War I, there were distortions and simplifications in how people saw things. hardly anyone talks about the fact that Ukraine actually became, in effect, a German military protectorate around 1917 or 18 during the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And of course, the Soviet Union, as the Bolshevik countermodel to the Western world, was seen as the absolute enemy. I think that's where this kind of simplification comes from.
Das verkürzt sich einfach daraus, ja.
Dieser Überfall auf die Sowjetunion.
The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was a war of annihilation. There was the Commissar Order, meaning political commissars were to be shot on the spot. There was also mass starvation in the prisoner of war camps. Why is that hardly talked about today, or only seen as a minor issue?
Keine oder nur noch eine untergeordnete Rolle.
Ja, es ist derzeit einfach auch nicht en vogue.
Yeah.
Wenn man sich jetzt anschaut,
Right now, it's just not really in
steht
vogue.
ja auch dann wieder fast
And if you look at it,
9.
May 9th is almost around the corner again. May 8th and 9th mark the end of the war. And once again, the discussion will be about how we commemorate that. It'll again be about the fact that the Russian embassy, along with the Belarusian consulate, or rather the first envoy of Belarus, and Kazakhstan, want to hold a memorial event together, especially here in Bavaria, in Dachau. Last year, it wasn't allowed. Why that decision was made, that's something people can argue about.
Da kann man sich drüber streiten. Ich kenne das Argument
I know the argument from local politicians. They say that, at the end of the day, there's a risk that the event could be used for propaganda, that it might draw a parallel to the current so-called special operation, which also involves a kind of fictionalization. They don't want to give people, or rather not the people, but state officials, the opportunity to agitate there. But the truth might be that there are less drastic options. There could, of course, be certain conditions set. For example, it could be clearly stated and communicated to the Russian, Belarusian, and Kazakh sides that drawing such parallels is explicitly not allowed.
dass diese Parallelen gezogen werden. Das wird nicht gemacht. Warum? Kann ich Ihnen nicht sagen.
That's not being done. Why? I can't tell you. There's a pretty interesting little story about it. Last year, the Belarusian ambassador was uninvited by the head of the memorial site. The strange thing was, there actually wasn't an ambassador anymore, and in the meantime, he had passed away. So there are a few issues where I think you could argue that what's happening is, diplomatically speaking, rather disrespectful. I really can't explain it. I'd say that's not how I was raised. I believe remembrance culture is about the past. People should be allowed to have that, and honestly, it creates more isolation than integration.
Denying the descendants of the victims the right to remember, for example, by banning the wearing of the St. George's ribbon. How do you view that?
Wie bewerten Sie das?
Ja, wie Sie schon gesagt haben.
Yes, as you already said, what matters to you is value, and I don't think there's any political reason for it. I believe it's purely ideological. I find that very difficult.
Gibt es im Bewusstsein der Deutschen, insbesondere der
Is there in the minds of Germans, especially West Germans, a kind of reversal of guilt? Reversal of guilt, you mean by that exactly? What I mean is this: those who were primarily responsible for the Second World War, namely the Germans, now present themselves as victims, while the real victims, among them, and above all, 27 million Soviet citizens, are now seen as the ones to blame.
Heute als die Schuldigen dastehen.
Naja, ich glaube, es gibt Tendenzen in die Richtung.
Well, I think there are tendencies in that direction, if you ask me that way. The point is it a direct reversal of guilt? I don't think so. But what I do think is this. After World War II, we kind of rewrote parts of our own history. We drew a line, maybe also because of the particular moral guilt we had taken on ourselves. And I believe that moral aspect is the key one here. That's also how we created our own sense of confidence, our own understanding of the state. And that's why, when it comes to shifting blame, I'm still not entirely sure how that's going to play out in the coming years. But of course, we have this sense that we're morally superior, and that gives us the feeling we have the right to judge things differently. And now you're bringing up the topic of remembrance. Commemoration just doesn't play a big role in our culture. That's simply the way it is. These are rituals, completely different in Russian culture. And so, from this position of moral superiority, we tend to say, well, get over it. Life has to move on.
Ja, das muss doch weitergehen. Und wenn das jetzt mal nicht stattfindet,
And if, for once, a memorial event in Dachau doesn't take place, it's really not that big a deal if you find an alternative location. And in fact, that's what's happening. But what people don't seem to understand is that on the Russian side, and not only there, also on the Belarusian side, and in the past, even on the Ukrainian side, it comes across very negatively. This moral stance we like to write down for ourselves, it elevates us, of course. And that was actually the original idea, that such things wouldn't happen to us again. So we take on the role of lecturing others. And that's exactly the point that I think the Russian, the Belarusian, and also the Kazakh side often criticize.
Would you agree with the spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, when she says, the Germans have forgotten, the Russians have forgiven?
Yeah, I think that's a good line.
What exactly did she mean by that, in her view?
Ja, sie hat natürlich gesagt, ich meine,
Well, she did say, of course, the Soviet Union was heavily influenced by German thought, specifically by Marx and Engels. So there was a very real inherent interest, and also naturally that connection in its time, however exactly it all played out with that train journey through Germany. But there was a genuine interest in not demonizing those ties. Otherwise, they would have had to face the question of why Marx and Engels, who were supposed to provide legitimacy for their own understanding of the state, were German in the first place. And that's why in some cases they had to forgive. They couldn't just forget. Well, that situation was real. A lot of people died. Countries, or rather entire regions, were destroyed. And we as Germans, this is what I mentioned earlier, we accepted that rupture, and in a way we turned it into something new, even something positive, probably from a statehood perspective. We transformed it into a kind of positive energy. Maybe not everything about it was positive, but we also had to forget certain things, and we had to look ahead. Still, we shouldn't forget or underestimate that other countries went through different experiences, and they draw their sense of legitimacy from those experiences. For Russia, the enemy was never in the East. The enemy has always been in the West. And in that sense, regions like Belarus or the Baltics are of little interest for different reasons. But of course, also Ukraine in 1918, when it was a military protectorate. Germany already had an interest there once. These are simply topics the Russian state is familiar with, that Russian history knows, that Russian military research knows. And from that, it draws its own sense of legitimacy. That doesn't have to be the same as ours. Now we're in this broader discussion about international relations, how narratives actually emerge, how they take shape, and what power really means. But in fact, Russia's legitimacy comes from its past, from its own experiences, while ours comes from ours. That's why, in part, they're incompatible. And in that sense, Zakharova's remark makes sense.
Does Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, give many Germans a chance to wash themselves clean morally? Yes, of course. Yes, of course.
That's exactly what people were waiting for. Yeah, I think so. And I think you can see that in wars like Syria, in wars like Libya, and also in the Balkan War. Yes, of course. The idea of Greater Serbia. There were some Serbian nationalists who came up with that term. And back then, in Germany, it was all over the press, even when I was younger, still in school. It was all about Milosevic, about these big Serbian fantasies of dominance. I think that's something people can really argue about. When German tanks are destroyed again in the Donbass today, what goes through your mind? Well, in Moscow there was this exhibition, oh God, what was it called again? I think it was the Triumph of War. They displayed military equipment that had been used in the special operation, in the war in Ukraine.
Und da standen auch deutsche Leoparden, ja. Und das
And there were German Leopard tanks standing there too. At Victory Park, the park built to commemorate the Second World War on Kutuzovsky Prospect. I go to Russia from time to time. My daughter's mother is Russian, her grandparents are Russian, and of course she should have a connection with them. That's not even a question. So I travel there periodically, and I don't make any secret of it. But it's really about maintaining family relationships. I want to make that clear. Still, we went to see it, and it was deeply unsettling, even overwhelming. Because regardless of whether one supports it or not, there are always different constellations. There's always a power perspective, an interest perspective, and also a narrative perspective. And in that sense, we've at least given up control over the narrative.
Is the support for Ukraine among German elites in some way an unconscious form of revenge for Stalingrad? I don't know.
But it's always interesting to see how uncritically it's accepted. I was recently at an event with a lot of business leaders, a lot of people from the financial world, and that was one of the topics. And I was really surprised by how opportunistic, yes, I want to use that word deliberately, and how uncritical the reaction was, or how quickly people just went along with it. But I also want to explain why. Germany isn't a high-tech hub, at least not in the IT sector. The startups we have, many of the ones we've built since 2014, and I won't name any so it doesn't come across the wrong way, but they're basically copies of major US startups. Is that a bad thing? No, it's not. You see the same in other countries too, in England, in France.
Nein, ist es nicht. Das gibt es in anderen Ländern auch, in England, in Frankreich. Und wenn wir an eBay denken und so weiter, das gibt es überall.
Well, if we think about eBay and so on, that kind of thing exists everywhere. But the fact is, we haven't really developed the kind of IT expertise you find, for example, in Belarus, or especially in the United States, in Silicon Valley, where I once lived and saw it firsthand. There, it wasn't just about building some e-commerce platforms. And I get the sense that institutional investors, in particular, have always had trouble assessing the odds of whether a startup will succeed or not. That's something people here have often said too. They've always said the German financial sector doesn't invest enough in modern startups and computer-based technologies.
Computergestützte Technologien. Wenn man sich jetzt anschaut, KI, wie viel
If you look at it now, AI, for example, when you compare how much investment is happening here in the US versus in China, Germany basically doesn't matter. And suddenly there's this opportunity to invest in an oligopoly market, a market we actually know. Industry. Industrial goods are familiar to us. That's something everyone here understands. I mean, we Germans grow up with crankshafts and precision gaps. That's just who we are. So suddenly, it's something we can actually assess. Plus, now we know the buyer is the state. Great. It's kind of like how Hochtief used to sell in Iraq. You'd make contacts with parliamentary speakers, leaders, and so on, and then you'd get government contracts. And that's pretty much how it works here too. So to me, it feels more like opportunism. I'm not sure it's anything else.
Ich weiß nicht, ob es was anderes ist. Ich glaube, es ist einfach opportun.
I think it's simply opportunistic. What does that even mean here? Opportunistic. Many German companies made a lot of money trading with Russia through cooperation and business deals. So why are those managers keeping quiet now?
That's a good question. I need to make a distinction here because you asked what opportunistic actually means. Opportunistic means it's the structural financing logic that says it's easier to invest in industrial goods that are in demand. Now, the real question is, why does the German mid-sized business sector find it so hard to take a clear position? I think there are a few reasons. For one thing, and this was a bit like what we saw during the COVID period, it becomes fashionable to jump on certain trends because they're safe in the media. And there are still many German companies, and that's no secret, that continue to operate in the Russian market. There are also many American companies. I mean, Italian companies are mostly the ones growing there. That's just how it is. In Germany, all of a sudden we have our own issue, of course. On the other side, there's the war of aggression. We can't support that. We ourselves were once the aggressor. So maybe there's a certain projection at play here. Another point is that, well, the media is partly very one-sided, and I'd say not very thorough, especially when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine. People quickly fall back on pastoral moral narratives where there's little interest in real debate. You can see that, I think, in German talk shows too. It's always the same people, always the same topics. You always have to start by apologizing, by making sure you say you don't support the Russian war in Ukraine, or the so-called full-scale Russian war of aggression. Well, where exactly is that full-scale war? The brutal one, right? Oh yes, I forgot to mention the brutal one. That always has to be added, and I think that makes it easy in a way. Let me give you an example. Back then, I once advised a company that had about 5,000 employees in the United States and 10,000 in Germany. In the US, they had, I think, around 300 lobbyists just for the American market. And in Germany, with 10,000 employees, there were 3. And I think that's also a reality. So, representation of interests often just doesn't happen. German companies, especially in the mid-sized sector, are usually in a comfortable position with high equity ratios. Then suddenly succession becomes an issue. The founder, maybe in his 80s, wants to hand the company over, but the son or the daughter might not be all that interested. There's uncertainty, other priorities, and people don't want to step into that minefield.
Und dann will man sich nicht auf dieses Minenfeld bewegen.
Are company owners, executives, and managers scared because they fear disadvantages during tax audits, loan approvals, and so on? I haven't seen that. Personally, I haven't experienced anything like it. I'd say it's more of an abstract fear of what people call a shitstorm. You, on the other hand, have a very different background. So how did you end up at Sberbank?
Wie sind Sie denn zur Sberbank gekommen?
Honestly, I got involved with Sberbank through the work I was doing back then in the United States. I was living in the US, working for SAP, and focusing on innovation and user-centered design. I built a pretty good reputation in that field and even had the chance to teach at Stanford. When I eventually moved back to Europe, a Russian university, Skolkovo, had already reached out to me, and they stayed in touch. Back then, flying from California to Moscow just wouldn't have been feasible time-wise. But once I was back here, and at that time there were still regular flights, about 200 hours of training, it was all about executive programs and block seminars. I really enjoyed that work. I accepted the offer, and that's how I'd say I gained a certain level of exposure, as people like to call it these days.
Ich hatte eine gewisse Exposure, wie man neudeutsch sagt, also sprich, ich war in einer Situation ausgesetzt, wo ich immer 5.
So I found myself in a situation where I kept meeting 50 or 60 new Russian managers, all about the same age, in an MBA program or some kind of executive training. And among them, there were always a few from Sberbank. Back then, the focus was on user centricity. The Russian banking and insurance markets were highly innovative, very modern, very tech-driven. That was the field I was working in. At some point, Sberbank asked if I could imagine joining them. I was going through a divorce at the time. You know how life goes. Munich suddenly felt gray, not so colorful anymore. And I thought, well, since I've always had a family connection there, I said to myself, this is a great opportunity. I'll do it.
You've seen it yourself and just mentioned that Russian high technology and Belarusian high technology as well are highly developed. Now, EU Commission President von der Leyen says the Russians are taking microchips out of washing machines to use them in missiles. What do you make of that?
Raketen rausschrauben. Was halten Sie davon?
Yeah, I think that's pretty populist. First of all, I believe that the Russian tech companies that need those high-precision chips are still getting them somehow, even today. I'm sure of that. Sure, there might have been a few isolated cases where something was taken apart for parts. But I mean, Russians as a people, and I say this with a bit of a smile because it's obviously a generalization, are incredibly resilient. They've been through a lot of crises. They understand that. It's still a collectivist society, even now, because they're used to that from the 1920s through the 90s. They know you have to stick together. The system provides a framework and tries to shape things, but of course, it runs into limits. Formal limits on individual action, or procedural limits. There's an incredible ability to improvise, especially compared to our own culture. We're very engineering-driven, very process-oriented, and we're good at scaling things up. That might be a bit harder for the Russians in some areas, but their ability to improvise is much, much stronger. And in that sense, I think you can actually see it as a strength. I mean, who else would think, I'll just take apart the washing machine, pull out the chip, and use it for something else?
I'm not sure a German engineer would immediately think of that. Do the West, or many people in the West, underestimate Russia's economic strength?
Yes, I think so. I really do. When you go to Russia today, and as I said, I'm there from time to time, well, Moscow isn't all of Russia, that's true. But in the end, there are a few big cities, Novosibirsk, Yekaterinburg, Moscow, Kazan, maybe you could add Rostov-on-Don. All of them are ultra-modern cities, and Moscow, of course, is by far the most modern. Oh, and I forgot Vladivostok. These are very urban areas, highly technological, deeply integrated into payment systems and navigation systems. And I don't just mean car navigation. I mean navigation in a broader sense. It's definitely impressive. And behind all that are major corporations. Yes, large IT companies like Sberbank as well, which is really more of an IT company with a banking license than a bank with an IT department. That includes companies like Yandex, Ozon, Wildberries, Lamoda, and others. I think that's quite impressive what's been built there. Of course, Russia is still a market for traditional resources, oil and gas, steel. And yes, things have become more difficult there, that's clear. But at the same time, unemployment is still practically at zero. There are about 1.6 million unemployed people out of a population of 143 million. That's basically full employment. Wages are rising, productivity is going up. Sure, you'd have to take a closer look at that. Not everything that glitters is gold, but it's not the case that Russia is on the verge of an economic collapse.
So, a country, a state with de facto full employment, with growth despite the war, with relatively compared to Germany's situation healthy public finances, with a huge sovereign wealth fund holding billions, and overflowing gold reserves that have even grown during the war. Has the war in Ukraine actually strengthened Russia?
I wouldn't say strengthened, but I think you have to make a bit of a distinction here. Economically, the war in Ukraine, just like the first sanctions back in 2014 when the food and agricultural industries were hit, has definitely pushed Russia to start doing things differently. And yes, to set new priorities. In the past, there were discussions like, we'll build our own airplane, or we'll make our own this or that, but those projects were often put on hold. I think now, instead of trying to compete with everything and everyone, they're focusing their efforts more clearly. Well, I think the food industry in Russia is rock solid. The banking industry is outstanding, the insurance industry is outstanding, and shipbuilding is slowly coming back. Is it going to be easy? No, of course not. The coal industry is declining a bit. I believe the steel industry has managed a turnaround in many areas, and yes, the real estate sector is going down a little. So I think Russia is still in a situation where it has to stay very flexible. But a country with 35,000 miles of external borders, you're not going to isolate that like North Korea. That's just the way it is.
Have the Western sanctions, especially those from the EU, actually become a driver of innovation for Russia?
Yeah, on the one hand, yes, I do think so. I think sanctions are like a slow-acting poison. People like to use that phrase, and there's definitely some truth to it. By the way, tariffs, like the ones we see here, are also a kind of slow poison. And energy insecurity works the same way for a society as sanctions do for Russia. So of course, that puts us in a certain kind of dependency. Is it a driver of innovation? In some ways, yes. But in other ways, foreign direct investment has clearly gone down. That's just a fact. Raising capital isn't as easy as it used to be. Russia would have developed differently. Would it have developed better? Well, that's a tough hypothetical question. It would have developed differently, that's for sure. I think Russia has already realized that there are certain areas where it needs to build core competencies. In the nuclear field, that's always been the case. In radio electronics, or electronics in general, they're trying to make progress again. In defense, they've always been quite strong. The steel industry has also always been strong. Coal, as I mentioned, is in a somewhat difficult situation. The e-commerce market, on the other hand, is strong. There's now a small but emerging middle class, especially in urban areas. That probably wasn't the case in the past. There used to be a lot of resellers, and that's really changed. So when it comes to these medium-sized urban initiatives, a lot has happened in Moscow, I'd say. Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the surrounding regions, yes, definitely.
Can we say that Western sanctions have in some areas actually accelerated innovation, but in others have acted as a brake on it?
Of course, it was a strategic partnership, especially for companies like Gazprom, Severstal, and NLMK. Those were Siemens turbines, Siemens rolling mills. Sure, that's how it was. Period. That kind of know-how isn't something you can just build up overnight. That's the reality. So what do you think overall about the 20 sanction packages you've had so far? Well, it's complicated. Honestly, I'm not even sure what that really means. You have to make distinctions there. I think the promise when the sanctions were first introduced was that they'd cut off Putin's money supply and bring the war to an end. That wasn't the case. But honestly, I never thought it was possible. There were just too many negative examples. If you ask, what was the idea behind the sanctions? Well, to limit Russia, to make things more complicated, fine. To restrict international financial flows, okay. But at the same time, there were plenty of special exemptions for buying oil and gas, and those kept happening. I think the point that was made publicly was always, yes, this will end the war. But that's not true, and in my view, it was never really possible. I think if they had really wanted to handle it seriously, they would have also dealt with all those people whose money they were happy to take in the past, like the oligarchs. Suddenly, they weren't necessarily expropriated, but their funds were seized or frozen. KYC processes were launched, and they were kicked out of the country. And even when it came to liberals, if the goal was supposedly to promote liberal ideas there, they did everything possible to make sure that didn't happen. They created a kind of fortress mentality. So I never really understood what the actual plan was supposed to be. Honestly, I think it was just populist. It simply wasn't thought through.
There are indications that back then, Minister of Economic Affairs Habeck didn't even have the impact of the sanctions evaluated. I've heard that too, and I believe that's what happened when Rosneft was placed under state supervision, which had consequences for the PCK refinery. Those are the last 1,000 jobs still left in that region. Absolutely. The efforts to freeze Russian foreign assets held at Euroclear in Brussels have been put on hold for now. Are they continuing? Yes, I'm sure they are. What options remain?
Well, I think Belgium was one of the countries that said, at the end of the day, the liability would have fallen on them. And I believe that was one of the reasons why they probably decided not to go through with it. For now, things will stay the way they are. People will keep looking for ways, trying to find loopholes, to keep funding Ukraine in its war against Russia. And I think if the very last resort is that Euroclear has to release the funds, then they'll probably do it.
So what exactly would you call that?
Expropriating Russian state assets. Because in the end, we always talk about a rules-based order. And the real question is, does a higher law exist? These are the kinds of things that build trust. And I think we should really avoid burning every bridge that's still standing. How would the financial markets react? If you look at it, even in Germany, a lot of money is invested from countries that aren't exactly our friends, not perfect democracies. Take Saudi Arabia or Singapore. Of course, they're impressive countries. Let's be honest about that. But you could probably raise some questions from a kind of morally elevated point of view. I think what happened in London was pretty clear. If you walk through the streets of London today, you don't see many Russians or many Chinese anymore. You see a lot of Arabs, of course. Wealthy Arabs, simply people with money. I mean, that's all it is. And the same thing will happen here. I'm sure we'll continue to face refinancing problems. I mean, foreign direct investment was already at a historic low under the, well, I was about to say the Habeck-led federal government, which isn't quite right, but under the red-green coalition government.
Foreign direct investment keeps declining. Are assets already being pulled out of Germany?
Yeah, I mean, you can see it. Millionaires and billionaires are moving their money to Switzerland, to France, even to Italy. There are some special regulations there too. And yes, of course, that's going to continue. Are we ruining ourselves? I think we are. At least partly, yes. I think so. Whether that's only because of Russia, I can't really say. But Russia definitely plays a role. The strategic partnership we've basically ended. I don't know. I mean, you can argue about it. We told Russia, we don't want to work with you. But with Qatar, we do. With Saudi Arabia, we do. The US is our #1 trading partner anyway, no matter what you think of Trump. I don't want to express a personal opinion here, but I think we also need to understand that we don't do business only with perfect democracies like Mauritania, Ghana, Burkina Faso, or Laos. That's just not possible. Companies like Hochtief and Bilfinger have built dams and canals in Lübeck and also in Iraq and Iran. And as far as I know, the German Chamber of Foreign Trade in Iran is still among the top 10 largest chambers in terms of membership. I can't really say how things are now, after the war began. But we've always had that German quality. As a country without traditional natural resources, we've relied on education and on a certain sense of realpolitik. You can see that if you think back to Brandt and Schmidt, to the Ostpolitik, or even to Alfred Herrhausen back then, who flew to Moscow. And if you know Yugoslavia, the relationship between Germany and Tito, and if you're aware of how many colleagues or fellow citizens from the Balkans came here, all of that plays a role. We've always stood out, because really, we could work with just about anyone. That's been our strength. So now, when we say we're changing that and moving toward a values-based foreign policy, a feminist foreign policy, whatever that ultimately means, but in any case, an ideologically driven foreign policy, that's quite an ambitious goal. And this transformation, well, I think politically, we've been transforming. We are transforming. Maybe we've actually been transformed for quite some time. But we never really thought about the fact that at some point, the voters would also have to support that kind of policy. And that's just not happening.
Are we doing moral politics instead of realpolitik in the Federal Republic? Yes, of course. No question about it. Absolutely.
Natürlich. Das sehen wir auch daran, dass ich weiß nicht, was war
We can see that too, for example. Was it Foreign Minister Habeck who landed in Brazil, where the environment minister greeted him? No, that was Miss Baerbock. And Miss Baerbock was also in China, where no one showed up, no one of equal rank came to meet her. So yes, of course, it's not getting any easier. Are we making fools of ourselves in this globalized world? I think a lot of people are asking what exactly this German special path is supposed to be now. It's probably yet another special path, but it's not going to end the way things did 80 or 90 years ago.
Was vor 80, 90 Jahren passiert ist, das auf gar keinen Fall, das ist schon klar. Aber es ist mit Sicherheit wieder eine
Absolutely not, that's clear. But once again, we're taking on a special role. You can see it. France has always pursued a realistic foreign policy. Always. You could see that in their missions in Central Africa, in Mali, in Libya. That's connected to the Foreign Legion, which is basically a national intervention force. France has always done that, Spain too, and Italy as well. So I wonder, why don't we? Yeah, exactly.
Ich frage mich, wir machen es halt nicht, ja.
Derzeit bemüht sich ja Berlin zusammen mit London und Paris.
Right now, Berlin, together with London and Paris, is trying to prolong the war in Ukraine by setting conditions that make any real compromise with Russia practically impossible while the Trump team is negotiating. So, is continuing the war in Ukraine for Germany a kind of bloody way of delaying bankruptcy?
Eine Art blutige Konkursverschleppung.
Ist eine blutige Konkursverschleppung und es ist einfach.
It's a bloody case of dragging out bankruptcy. And it's simple. It's just simple. I think Rubio said today that the NATO alliance is also being put to the test. Something like that. One way or another, that's what he said. And of course, I think the lack of support from NATO partners in the Strait of Hormuz, which is what the Americans are focused on, or in a possible war with Iran, will probably be used as leverage by Trump's very transactional style of politics in the Ukraine situation. I believe that under the Trump administration, the Americans have no real interest in continuing a Russian-Ukrainian war, because they clearly understand that their real economic and strategic rival on the global stage is China.
Im geopolitischen Stab China ist. Ja, und da ist es natürlich leichter, wenn man einen guten Zugang nach Moskau hat.
And of course, it's easier if you have good access to Moscow than if you don't. I think that's part of the American interest, at least partly, and I can understand that. And yes, we're taking a special path again here. If you ask me why, well, that's the big question. I think it comes down to how narratives are shaped. In international theory, people always ask, what is power, really? Historically, it's been seen as military and economic power, but we probably need to add something to that. There's also narrative power. And that's something we just don't have.
Und die haben wir hier halt nicht. Und es ist halt hier unheimlich, weil wir haben kein zentrales.
And that's what makes it so tricky here. We don't have a centralized system that can just change a narrative. You could say that's probably easier in Russia, though I can't say for sure. It's probably also quite easy in countries like China, Belarus, or Saudi Arabia, even though they obviously have illiberal aspects. There, you can simply set political tones from the top. Now, that doesn't mean everything is dictated. I want to be clear about that. I don't necessarily believe that. But here, that kind of thing is sometimes just impossible. And I think the loss of narrative power we've seen here leads to this feeling that we can't turn the ship around anymore. So people figure it's easier to just keep going the way we are.
Und deswegen ist es einfacher, wir machen so weiter.
Die Politik der Vereinigten Staaten war darauf gerichtet.
U.S. policy was aimed at expanding NATO eastward, including bringing Ukraine into it. The result was that Russia and China moved closer together. Now the Trump administration is realizing, quite realistically, that it can't make progress in Ukraine and naturally wants to pull Russia away from China in order to focus more on China itself. But what's the interest of the European, of the German elites, in continuing the war in Ukraine?
Der deutschen Eliten an der Fortsetzung des Krieges in der Ukraine.
Sie führen mehr Gespräche als ich, das müssen Sie mir beantworten. Ich kann es Ihnen nicht sagen.
You talk to more people than I do, so you'll have to answer that one. I really can't say. I think in the end, well, what even is the German elite? Do you mean the political class? For example, yes. I think the political class in the end is about opportunistic behavior. It's all about opportunism. career paths are limited. And I think, German politicians from the major parties, the ones who aren't seen as having much economic expertise, they move into state institutions or organizations that aren't exactly government but close to it. That's their career path. Those organizations are funded by foundations. They're not funded by companies like ThyssenKrupp, BMW, or Audi, and so on.
Die sind nicht finanziert von ThyssenKrupp, von BMW, von Audi. Ja, weil warum sollte BMW jemanden holen?
Yeah, because why would BMW hire someone who's already sitting in the Bundestag? That really wouldn't make much sense. They already have their top lobbyist in there, so why would they need to hire more people? And I think that's part of the issue. The career paths are already set. I think there's a lot of opportunism going on, because honestly, I can't explain it any other way. I don't believe in some grand master plan. Maybe it exists, but I just don't buy it. I think things just happen the way they happen. A lot of it is transactional. A lot of it comes down to proximity, to personal connections, to these agent-type situations. And then you're sitting in Berlin, and of course you know the Hans Seidel Foundation and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation.
Dann kenne ich dort die Leute und
And then I know the people there, and it just kind of falls into place. I think there's very little mixing. A good friend of mine, a journalist, once told me a story about being at a journalists' gathering. He wasn't exactly an outcast, but he was controversial, maybe among his colleagues. And he asked them, "So, who here studied in the United States?" About 60% of the hands went up. Who studied in England? 20%. Who studied in Switzerland? 10%. Who studied in France? 5%. And who studied in Moscow? No one. Who studied in China? No one. And I think that's just how it is. Things are often simpler than they seem, I think.
So it's about protecting your own career, pushing it forward, and then of course you want to keep tweeting along in the transatlantic chorus. Absolutely.
Absolut. Und dann habe ich eine moralische Überzeugung, das ist einfach.
And then I have a moral conviction. It's simple. It's actually simpler than trying to take someone else's perspective. Russia is a Putin-style macho state. Putin comes from the KGB, he's an intelligence man. But no, if you live in Moscow, you live a very relaxed, very free life. The tax system there is professional and quite liberal. There's a lot of trust toward the citizen. Here, our tax system is built on the assumption that the state doesn't trust its citizens. Those aren't my words. We heard that last time from Paul Ronsheimer, who had a great guest on his podcast. But that's the basic mindset, and that's not how it is in Moscow.
Aber das ist das Grundverständnis. Das ist in Moskau nicht so. Nein, überhaupt nicht.
No, not at all. When the German elites are tied into the transatlantic network, when they're oriented toward it, and that's really the result of all this, are we even a sovereign country anymore? Yeah, that's a good question.
Das ist so die gute Frage. Ich glaube, wir können souverän sein. Wir müssen die Souveränität noch.
I believe we can be sovereign. We just have to actually embrace that sovereignty. What would that mean? Well, it would mean that we act in line with our own interests. But first, we have to define what those interests are. Is that possible with the current political elite? I'd say, I think, therefore I am. It shouldn't be impossible. I can't tell you why people...
Ich kann Ihnen nicht sagen, warum man das.
The alternative would be to bring about a change of elites. How are we supposed to do that?
Wie wollen wir das machen? Jeder Bürger kann wählen, im Zweifel. Jeder Bürger kann.
Every citizen can vote, if in doubt. Every citizen can take to the streets, protest against something. And people do, on the right, on the left, in the center, and outside the center. We can all do something. But as long as we keep on like this, it's a new Biedermeier era, isn't it? Let's be honest, there's Netflix. I always tell this little story. When I look at my circle of friends here, nobody sits down at 8 o'clock to watch the evening news anymore. They're on Netflix. Maybe they go out for dinner. In Russia, I don't know a single one of my friends who watches television. Not one. People go to the movies, or they watch films at home.
Die Leute gucken Kino, die gucken Film zu Hause. Aber ich kenne keinen meiner russischen.
But I don't know any of my Russian friends who watch TV as regularly as my German friends do. That's also a kind of inactivity. Maybe to add a comparison here, for a Russian computer engineer, it just doesn't make sense to work in Germany, salary-wise. It really doesn't. If you're a junior software developer, you're better off working in Russia. You earn more in equivalent terms, and your purchasing power is higher anyway. It just doesn't make sense. And we also live in our own little bubble. We've been raised in a way to be somewhat inactive. I mean, who actually joins clubs or associations anymore?
Ich meine, wer organisiert sich schon in Verein? Wir sind ja auch keine Schweizer, die eine Vereinskultur haben.
We're not like the Swiss, who have that strong club culture. That's just not who we are. Are the Germans kind of sleepwalking toward their own downfall? Yeah, absolutely. In my view, they really are sleepwalkers. Now, that doesn't mean people are wrong by nature, but maybe our ability to think critically has been, well, I don't want to say trained out of us because that's a pretty heavy phrase. And if I say it's been trained out of us, the next question is, by whom? But look, we can do whatever we want. We can shape our lives however we choose. No one's stopping us. We can write to our state representative or a member of the local council today and set up a meeting.
Das macht doch keiner. Aber warum nicht, kann ich Ihnen nicht
Nobody does that. But why not? I really can't tell you. I just can't. All I can say is, I keep up my connections in the region. Why don't people know their neighbors anymore? It starts small. We're already, well, even in English they say compartmentalized. We're being split apart and over-individualized. I can definitely see that. And I think that's a general trend. You can describe it in terms of digitalization, but of course you could also frame it as part of some bigger plan. I just want to look at the effect itself. But of course, we're presented as individuals, even though we're actually much more alike than we think.
So dargestellt und trotzdem sind wir viel gleicher als wir denken. Ja.
Alle reden von Rüstung.
Ja.
Everyone's talking about armament. So are we. And every step toward more weapons and more military power is seen by the other side as a greater threat. And then they arm up in response. That's the escalation dilemma we're in. You come from the business world. So what gets us out of this escalation trap? Even more weapons?
Noch mehr Rüstung, Krieg, oder gibt es eine Alternative?
War. Or is there an alternative? First of all, we really need to talk again about this dilemma of escalation. And we should take another look at our basic geopolitical self-image. We have a liberal, constructive understanding of the world. The Russians have a realpolitik understanding. That simply comes from their history, period. By the way, the Germans once had that too. So what does that mean? Realpolitik means that power is essentially defined by military and economic strength. And sovereignty is also defined by drawing boundaries. And we draw those boundaries by being strong, economically and militarily. If we keep distancing ourselves now, meaning if we suddenly start rearming, something we haven't done in the past, then from the perspective of the other side, especially China and Russia, that's naturally going to look like we're being aggressive. If we don't openly say that we're acting out of realpolitik, it means we have an interest we're not being transparent about. In other words, we're making ourselves ready for war. And from their point of view, that actually makes sense. Now, we could say again that the Russians are stuck in their old geopolitical thinking. But no, they're not. Things have just developed differently. And we, on our side, say that sovereignty is in principle something that can be shared.
Souveränität ist grundsätzlich teilbar. Institutionen, also unterhalb der ersten
Institutions, meaning those below the top layer of power, also provide stability. And that's not wrong. But we tend to deny that other countries see power and economics as sources of power, and that they don't necessarily share our perspectives. At some point, one side has to start seeing things from the other's point of view. You could say someone has to be the smarter one. And if it comes down to it, I'm fine with that being me. But what we probably need is a kind of paradoxical intervention. What does that mean? It means we have to do things differently from what's expected. Back then, Gerhard Schroeder went to Moscow. So why didn't Friedrich Merz fly to Moscow? I think no one would have seen that coming.
Keiner wird damit rechnen. Oder Macron kündigt es ja immer an, oder Keir Starmer.
Well, Macron always announces it, or Christian Dahmer does. Trump does a lot of paradoxical things, where the other side doesn't really know what it means in that moment. Take Anchorage, for example. Meeting in a place that's symbolically charged, and that also happens to have a large Orthodox community, the biggest Russian Orthodox community outside of Russia. That, of course, has value for the Russian Federation, because the conservative worldview and view of humanity are important parts of its narrative. And Trump handled that very skillfully. Anchorage may not have produced the results people were hoping for, but still, if you look at how Russia showed up there, it was significant.
Wenn man sich sieht, auch wie Russland angereist, ich glaube mit Verteidigungsminister, mit Außenminister.
I think it was with the defense minister, the foreign minister, and Dmitry Peskov, the press secretary of the Russian president. That was a high-level delegation. And at that time, they were actually flying into what was considered an enemy country. It was a very bold move by Russia, and also a very bold move by Trump. Just like back then, the meeting with Kim Jong-un, if I remember correctly, that's who he met. And where was that again? Japan? South Korea? I can't quite recall. Anyway, he met him at the demarcation line. I think those are the kinds of moments that can really make a difference. What matters afterward, though, is building trust. Those are, of course, gestures of goodwill at first, but you have to back them up. And that's maybe where Trump isn't quite as strong.
Da ist vielleicht Trump nicht ganz so stark.
Das kann man sagen.
You could say that. Recently, Oscar Lafontaine also complained that because of this lack of trust, there's no path to peace in the Iran conflict either. Yes, the Iran conflict as well.
You enter negotiations in order to rearm. That's basically the same debate we had over Minsk, just applied to Iran, and of course, over a shorter period of time. When you know that Merkel said, yes, we knew a conflict could happen, and yes, we used that time to arm Ukraine, well, it's the same thing here. That doesn't build trust. You have to stand by what you do, and you have to have a clear position.
There used to be some common ground. For example, the Charter of Paris, written right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when people said we'd base things on the principle of common security. The Russians still hold on to that idea. But today in NATO, the message is, peace only exists against Russia, not with Russia. Now, I've never heard anyone say, I'm making peace against you. How is that supposed to work? Of course it doesn't. That's just a euphemism.
Funktioniert natürlich nicht. Das ist ein Euphemismus. Ich glaube, das ist klar. Ja. Und das ist genauso Narrativbildung und Mobilisierung.
I think that's pretty clear, and that's exactly what narrative building and mobilization are about. People use the word peace in the context of an actual war. I'd say that's the very definition of a euphemism. It's nonsense. And again, I think it's all about shaping a narrative. On one hand, they try to present themselves as peacemakers, but on the other, they're pushing their own agenda. I don't think that gets us anywhere. And of course, that brings us into this whole debate about doublespeak. It's not even that unusual. The human brain works through shortcuts, through patterns, heuristics, and what in English we nicely call chunks. We're always looking for points of connection. We hardly ever really listen. If you think about music today, say rap songs from the US, they're often just a chain of highly emotional, highly magnetic words. And what sticks with you when you listen isn't the context anymore. It's the feeling.
And I think that's exactly what's happening there. You're talking about narrative building. Is this NATO narrative building meant to serve the purpose of
dem Zweck, den Krieg fortzusetzen?
Yes, this is a mobilization of society, of course, because people here also know when you talk to them, there are always these polls depending on who conducts them, and the results are usually quite divided, whether people think they support the war or oppose it. It's somewhere between about 30 and 48% for or against, something like that. I wouldn't say, you can't really say, that it's an absolute majority that consistently supports the war. I don't believe that.
And of course, there's also active preparation going on. By 2029, Germany, including its economy, is supposed to be ready for a war against Russia. You come from the business world. How is that being received in the companies?
Wie kommt das in den Unternehmen an?
Das wird ignoriert. Es wird ignoriert.
That's being ignored. Everyone's just hoping it'll be over soon. So when I talk to people, to clients, look, no one has to share my opinion. That's totally fine. I respect that. And I don't push it on anyone. I'm not trying to lecture anybody. But when someone does ask, because, people can go to my LinkedIn profile and see it. Back when I was at Sberbank, of course, we'd also talk privately about my daughter, about summer vacation, and yes, I was in Moscow. Honestly, people are always interested, and everyone regrets what's happened. I don't really know any business leaders or top executives, and of course I don't know them all, that's obvious. But the ones I do know, they all think it's very damaging.
So does your work for Sberbank count as a plus for you?
Im Regelfall schon. Im Regelfall schon.
Usually, yes. Usually, yes. Honestly. And even when again, I still get, well, we're in touch with Ukrainian banks and with citizens from time to time. No question about it. Whether it's about a position or someone looking to hire, that's all received positively. People say, my God, you understand our culture. You get how I think. And again, I'm not an apostle or an apologist. I'm not trying to lecture anyone or push anything on them. And I'm not a pessimist either. That's seen in a positive light, because people in Ukraine also say, we share a common cultural background. We share common values. Politically, you can take whatever position you want on that. And of course, some people have now experienced personal loss, whether on the Russian side or the Ukrainian side. People are dying on both sides, and everyone regrets that. Some react more emotionally than others, but that's completely normal.
Do you personally get the impression that the business community in Germany is longing for failed policies to finally come to an end?
I do think so. People would want that failed policy to come to an end. But it's not just about Russia. China plays a role too, and of course the United States, and really all kinds of other countries and issues as well. I'm thinking, for example, about compliance and ESG topics. I think that's something people would definitely like to see change. And when it comes to Russia, many business owners, especially in the mid-sized sector, were active there. They really regret what happened. Some of them also regret having to pull out because it felt like they were under pressure to do so.
Yes, that's how I would see it. For example, within the business-oriented parties like the CDU or the FDP, are there forces pushing for a change in policy? How do you perceive that?
I think a lot of people have maybe just given up. There have been cases, whatever you think about them. Like, I think there was once an invitation from a business association, maybe involving an AfD member of parliament. I'm not sure anymore. That story made quite a few headlines at the time. And I don't want to say that the AfD is the only party that takes a different position here, but it's definitely a party that's very active in opposing this war. And of course, it has a certain level of support among the public. Yeah, I think many companies are worried about that.
We talked earlier about U.S. President Trump. You said he took bold steps in Anchorage, Alaska, met with Putin, and during his first term even visited North Korea. And you say he often intervenes in paradoxical ways. Is that a strategy of deliberate chaos to achieve results?
Yes.
Well, his politics are definitely more transactional. And it's also clear that he judges politics through attention, through which topics get attention, and that he assigns moral value and even punishment based on that. Now, in a world as complex as ours, the real question is, would things have turned out differently under Biden? I'm convinced the conflict would have kept escalating. I'm sure that under Biden, it would have continued to escalate. Why? Because the forces of inertia within the Biden administration were simply much stronger. And that's not meant as criticism. It's just a description of the situation.
Das ist auch jetzt gar kein Vorwurf, das ist einfach nur Zustandsbeschreibung. Ja, so. Und Trump hat natürlich da schon eine gewisse Friktion.
And of course, Trump has brought a certain amount of friction into the picture. Through his own transactional approach, which he applies to international relations, the so-called madman theory, he gives the whole thing a very personal flavor. That's why we talk about Trump diplomacy, not the diplomacy of the MAGA Republicans. It's specific to Trump. I'm sure it would be different under Rubio and under J.D. Vance as well. Maybe more successful, maybe less, I don't know. But under Trump, that's how it is. I believe he creates opportunities. I really do. And I think that we as the world's third largest economy, and now I'm speaking from a realpolitik perspective, because of our economic strength, we have power. We could fill in, build trust, and do things that Trump simply can't.
Tun kann, Vertrauen aufbauen, füllen. So, und jetzt denken wir wieder weg von dieser realpolitischen Sichtweise.
And now, let's move away from that purely realpolitik perspective for a moment. What we're actually missing is the desire to shape the narrative, to have a certain authority over it. And by authority, I don't mean that we need to adopt a completely different point of view. Maybe, well, not one where we say Putin is a great person or a great leader. We don't need to make that kind of judgment, not about the person, not about the leader or the role he plays. But maybe we should return to a more interest-driven kind of politics. Because of course, we can only afford the things we're currently promoting if we remain economically strong as a country.
When you see that German politics is falling short of its potential, would you agree with the satirist Wiglaf Drosta's line, "When the brain comes up short, people like to reach for morality"? Yes, I would. It's really that simple.
Es ist einfach. Wissen Sie, es ist einfach. Wir müssen uns nicht mehr mit Details auseinandersetzen.
You know, it's actually quite simple. We don't need to deal with the details anymore. We can just leave the whole contextualization behind, completely forget about it. When we talk about moral responsibility, it's always a responsibility tied to a specific culture or to individuals. And then we fall back on universal values. That's the classic German Enlightenment philosophy, carried on by thinkers like Habermas, and from a German perspective, I think that's valid. But these are values we don't even live up to ourselves. That's another point, and it adds to the problem. From a philosophical standpoint, it can make sense. But you're absolutely right. Many of the things we demand from Russia, we don't follow ourselves. Or we just look the other way when our American partners cross certain lines, like in the Iraq War, for example.
Of course, Friedrich Merz said, "This isn't the time to criticize our allies."
And I think that's really a point where many people now feel left behind, where they see politics as out of touch. And I believe it would just be more honest to say, America is our ally, and we stand by that. Or like Schroeder said back then, we're allies, but not in that case. I think we need to find clearer language for that.
Of course, in politics. What do you think of Spain's approach? For example, not granting the Americans overflight rights.
Yeah, I think that's consistent. It's consistent because Spain, the Spanish government, has to look after its own citizens and its own interests. And if they decide that this is Spain's role, with all the consequences that come with it, like tariffs or travel warnings to Spain from the US State Department, then that's consistent. I think that's fine. Because in the end, Spain is a sovereign country. Sovereignty can be shared, but it doesn't have to be. In this case, it's sovereignty that isn't shared. And if Spain wants to do that, it can.
Morality in international politics, does that even exist?
Yes, that's a good question. I think it really comes down to how the state sees itself. In Germany, we do have moral authorities. That can be the family. a father or mother toward their children, grandparents toward their own children or grandchildren. We have the German churches, and I think we also have many associations. I believe we should be a system that balances things out. The state can take positions, but its main priority should always be to keep itself capable and effective.
Natürlich sein, den Staat leistungsfähig zu erhalten. So, das heißt jetzt aber auch nicht zwingend, dass man
That doesn't necessarily mean we should say that every adventure going on in the world is something we have to approve of, reject, or stay out of completely. But we should ask ourselves, what's our own self-image? Again, we'll only be able to afford morality if we can actually afford it. If we keep slowing down the economy, if we start talking about energy lockdowns or things like that, well, we're not really an IT hub. SAP is the only major DAX company that emerged after reunification from the tech or IT sector. There really isn't much else.
Aus dem technischen Bereich, aus dem IT-Bereich, da gibt's nicht viel anderes. Ja, wir leben von Siemens, wir leben von BMW, von Audi.
Yes, we live off Siemens, off BMW, Audi, all the big ones, Kraus Maffei, of course, and Knorr-Bremse, and all the others. These are engineering companies. We produce things. We don't produce commodities. And by the way, we've rarely done that since China became the world's extended workbench. We live on innovation leadership. And that, in my view, has to be our mindset. And for that, we simply need partners. Sometimes it might actually be better to have strong business relationships, because when we have good relationships, we can influence our partners in other ways. Just look at Gerhard Schroeder, for example.
The Americans say they're exporting democracy, and as luck would have it, they find oil. We export feminist foreign policy and come back empty-handed. How do you assess that?
Wie beurteilen Sie das?
Ja, schwierig. Das ist halt eben so ein bisschen diese Planlosigkeit, die ich
Yeah,
Ich glaube,
it's
die
tricky.
Amerikaner, die brechen schon
That's kind of a symptom of the lack of direction I see. I think the Americans, to some extent, translate their own idea of the state and their own sense of hegemony into political action. We don't do that. Political or economic action, none of that, really. That's what I meant earlier. I think the political class is pushing its own agenda, while German industry is just sort of along for the ride. I'd like to see a much closer connection between the two.
Ich würde mir eine stärkere Verzahnung wünschen. Ja, aber es gibt natürlich aber auch Karrierewege.
But of course, there are also career paths that are more limited here. I mean, if you hold a position or a role in an association, I assume you tend to stay there for quite a long time. In the US, that kind of thing changes much faster. And that's not just because of political shifts. No, it's also about how people see themselves. After 5 or 6 years, they'll often say, I want to do something different. Here, stability is seen as one of the highest values. And culturally, it's just different in the US.
Is the German political class, in this transition to a multipolar world, actually following Germany's own interests?
No, not that.
I think people still don't see the shift toward a multipolar world. In reality, it's already happening. But in practice, there's still a firm hold on the unipolar dominance of the United States.
Ja, man hält unter, ja, das ist jetzt interessant, ja.
Yes, that idea still holds. And that's interesting. I think in this case, too, it's about how institutions are understood. People say that economic and financial power aren't the central factors, that what really matters is stability. Stability created through communication within institutions. But of course, there is a hegemon, and that's the Americans, the idea of American exceptionalism. That's undisputed. It's also recognized by Germany in practice. Maybe it's not always stated so openly, but that's how it is. I mean, we've seen how many presidents and heads of state from the EU flew to meet with Trump. Yeah, those little schoolboys, and everyone saying how great he is, right in the first sentence. And sure, it was kind of nice to watch, actually, because it was so unusual. But yes, of course it feels... I think the shift toward multipolarity is being rejected, and at the same time, it's already happening. Because when Friedrich Merz flies to Africa and visits small countries that usually aren't on the radar, shaking hands with dictators, well, it's the same thing we saw yesterday in Syria. Completely absurd images. Absurd images. And then he goes on to declare that 80% 100% of Syrians should or must go back home.
Prozent der Syrer sollen, müssen nach Hause. Ja.
From the perspective of a management consultant, a headhunter with international experience, what needs to change in German politics? Well, I think we need to understand.
Ja, ich glaube, wir müssen verstehen, dass es natürlich, dass wir
Of course, we're part of a continuum. We all are, and I don't mean this to sound pastoral, but we're all only here on Earth for a limited time. Let's make it concrete. We have to understand that a state has its own interests, and our interests should be to make sure that in our local community, in our county, in our city, and so on, within our larger structures, we create the kind of security we ourselves have experienced. That's it. That's what it's about. And of course, we should do that in the best possible relationship with our neighbors.
In dem bestmöglichen Verhältnis mit unseren Nachbarn. Das hat hier was mit der Gemeinde Heidhausen zu tun, wenn ich
That has something to do with the community of Heidhausen when I'm in Bogenhausen. Then it's connected to the city of Munich, within the Munich district. But it's also about Germany in relation to Poland, Germany in Europe, and Germany in the world. And I think that needs to happen. We have to get specific about it, and we should understand what that really means. That's what taking another perspective is about. My freedom ends where someone else's freedom begins. And that other person's freedom also exists in Poland, and in Russia too. That's just how it is.
Polen und die ist auch in Russland und so ist das halt.
German politics does not follow German interests, says business consultant and manager Dr. Oliver Kempkens. Thank you very much for that. Here at Against the Current, we present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden. Stay with us. Music.
Bleiben Sie dabei.